Вітання усім. Перша прес-конференція на сьогодні – це презентація.
Good morning, everybody. We are now holding our meeting on the topic of the ineffective management and corruption risks within the system of providing housing to military personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. And we have James Wasserström, co-chairman of the Independent Anti-Corruption Committee of Defense, Mr. Volodymyr, and co-chairman of the Independent Anti-Corruption Committee of Defense, Igor Stadnytsky, officer who has been waiting for housing for many years himself. Mr. Ohryzko says, I was thinking about how to better initiate our today's communication, our conversation, and I decided to start it with a quote. It's a quote from one document. I will later explain it to you what document's that. Thanks to the Great October Socialist Revolution, the premises were created and conditions were created for providing housing to the majority of the population of our country, to all the population of our country. And expressing and materializing the principles of Marxism-Leninism, the Soviet state is materializing the Communist Party program of providing housing to all the residents of the country, to all the population of the country. Well, so what document is that? It can consider to you strange that I started by reading it out, but it's the housing code that was in effect in the Soviet time period of our history. It's just to provide a background about what's going on in the housing provisions and housing granting of the houses to the servicemen and women. As you know, our committee, NAKO, helps in the struggle against corruption within the defense ministry system. And regrettably, we are far from being able to say that everything has become okay, has become all right in the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Although I would like to point it out right away that the leadership of the ministry are very interested in supporting the efforts every effort to resolve this problem. Why? What's the reason? Because today, in this waiting list for the housing, that is granted free of charge, there are 47,000 servicemen and women of Ukrainian army. For them to get their housing, for them all to get their housing under the existing system, 658 years. I pause here and repeat it again. 658 years are needed. And unfortunately, under the present system of housing distribution, to house all these people is simply impossible. So the question is, what's needed to be done to give our servicemen, and among them, as you know, there are the heroes, what should be done in order for them not to get their housing in 650 years, but within the next, let's say, within the next few years. That's the reason why our anti-corruption committee decided to draw the attention of the public to this topic. And let me repeat it again, emphasize it again, that we are very grateful to the leadership of the Defense Ministry of Ukraine, and we are grateful to the Directorate of the Defense Ministry that is in charge of the housing. They sustained and have been sustaining our efforts all the way through. So a lot of experts has been working on this topic, and the result, so to say, provisionary result of their efforts is this research, is the report on the results of their research. You can collect one, get one at the entrance to this conference hall, and in this report, the first, so to say, the first approximation, or the first approach, rather, was made to assess the scope of the very scope of the problem. We certainly are not going to stop at this point in time being fully satisfied with this report. We are going, and I'm going to give the floor now to Mr. Wasserström, our co-chairman, and we are going to continue our efforts and probably look at the other areas or spheres of these problems, how the other parts of the real estate of the Ministry of Defense are treated, what's happening to the land that is under the ownership of, in the ownership of the Defense Ministry, and so on. What are the wrongdoings and how can they be tackled? So it is my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Mr. James Wasserström, my colleague, who's going to inform you more in detail about the results of our research, and after that, we be able to continue our discussion on this topic that we present to you, are presenting to you today. Mr. Wasserström is taking the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Volodya. Dobry den to one and all. Sorry. If we could go to the first of the slides, so we could see. Is this?
It's okay.
Okay. One of the main issues that servicemen face is after having done sacrifice to fight at the front and to fight for Ukraine's sovereignty, is the mistreatment that they receive when they're looking to receive the benefit, the privilege, the entitlement to housing. And as Volodya has mentioned, right now there is a waiting list of 47,000 people who are eligible for this kind of housing. And as Volodya mentioned, 600 years of waiting. This is simply an unacceptable situation, and it creates victims out of the individuals who have given so much for Ukraine. In our research, we found that this waiting list is not shrinking. This waiting list is growing. So the next slide, please. In the first slide, next slide, please. And if you notice in this first slide, you'll see the two lines which I think very simply describe the situation. The lower line is the number of apartments that have been provided during the period in question, from 2006 to 2016. The upper line shows the individuals on the waiting list. One would like to see these two lines cross, that the supply, that the number of individuals and the number of apartments meet somewhere in the middle, but they don't. They remain in parallel. That indicates that this waiting list never diminishes. This is a system that is dramatically broken. If over the course of the years, these two lines do not intersect. And why they do that is due to a certain amount of dysfunctionality including corruption, within the military quartering directorate. Next slide. The governance challenges and corruption risk that exist within the directorate concerned are numerous. First, as you can see from the slide, buildings are ordered and paid for and not constructed. There is a tremendous amount of centralized decision-making with little oversight, and that extends over a whole range of decision-making. There is not sufficient tracking of who is in the queue and what homes are available, as we discussed in the previous slide. So there are a number of gaps in oversight which need to be corrected, and the report details exactly what those gaps are. Some of the reports that we've heard are that people have to pay to get in on the line, people have to pay to move up the line, and people have to pay to get off the line. There are also bribes that take place for individuals who are not on the line to get housing. And there are a number of issues in connection with the provision of new construction of housing for servicemen. So this system needs dramatic overhaul. The second point that I'd like to mention in connection with this is that there doesn't seem to be much of a strategy on the part of the directorate concerned as to how to manage this housing issue. It is legal to provide financial support to servicemen for them to find their own housing, yet this option is seldom chosen, whereas it is standard practice in other countries, which I will get to in a moment. If you look at the next slide, and we all understand Ukraine's aspirations to become part of NATO. I know it's a campaign issue. For example, in the upcoming presidential election, you'll see that in the NATO countries indicated above, USA and UK, there is no such thing as this kind of commitment to provide housing. That in the US and UK, for example, service housing is provided and permanent housing is not provided. There are support programs to servicemen who leave the service to help them find housing, but there is no commitment to actually provide them with housing itself. So as Ukraine moves in the direction of NATO and wishes to adhere to NATO standards, this is one standard to which Ukraine is not presently adhering. And although there is the commitment to move in this direction by 2021, that seems to be very ambitious unless there are dramatic measures taken immediately. In our last slide, we have some ideas in the report as to what these measures might be. Right now, as the slide indicates, there are empty promises. Apartments for anyone who needs them, severance pay for everybody, lack of service housing, salaries higher than the market. These do not exist. What we propose is a transitional period of 5 years toward the elimination of this housing provision in favor of NATO best practice. Best practice is in the last box under final. Lucrative severance pay for everybody, service housing of good quality, and an annual allowance of a decent standard, so that serving soldiers will be provided with appropriate housing, and those after service entitled to benefits will receive support, financial support, monetized support for the purchase of suitable accommodation, perhaps one time, perhaps spread over a period of years. In the transition, that particular decision is a political decision, and it's going to be very difficult because there are 47,000 people who've been waiting, in some cases for decades, for this to come to fruition. It has not come to fruition. So someone within government, and I presume at the very top of government, will have to change the policy. Perhaps it could emerge from the Verkhovna Rada, that to change this policy and abandon it in favor of the NATO standard, which is this monetization. And we have provided within the report a roadmap in the recommendations as to how to get from where we are now, this failed Soviet system, to one which adheres to Euro-Atlantic standards. And that transition would be some mortgage loan assistance, as you can see in the center of this particular slide, severance pay, active allocation of service accommodation, no more queue, cut the queue. Sorry, not cut the queue, eliminate the queue, and a systematic increase in salaries. So this will take courage. And this actually, I think, from what I understand, is a good moment for courage. As we all know, Ukraine is going to be holding presidential elections in the next 6 months, and then legislative elections 6 or 7 months thereafter. I think this is a moment for civil society, in particular, to exert some influence on the presidential candidates to commit to this dramatic change in policy and to show the courage necessary. It will address the corruption issues that we've just talked about, and the report goes into considerable detail of instances of corruption, not just the ones I've mentioned, but a whole variety of schemes that are alleged to be taking place within the directorate concerned, and should be front and center of the agenda for whoever is elected president or elected to the Verkhovna Rada going forward. I'd like to acknowledge that the Ministry of Defense, the minister, as Volodya had mentioned, requested this report directly. And we are aware that there's also interest in the presidential administration in this particular issue. So we know that the ministry is sensitive to the need for reform, and they have been extremely helpful and cooperative with us in the preparation of this document, for which we are very grateful. But our work on this topic will not stop with this housing report. We have agreed as a committee that one of our next focal areas over the next 12 months will be to begin to look closely at land and real estate, real property that's owned by the Ministry of Defense, to see what has happened with those hundreds of thousands of hectares that are owned by the ministry. We are aware, of course, that some has been misappropriated, for example. So we are going to be looking more deeply at how the ministry has handled these issues, and how what corruption or what other risks may exist. Corruption is not inefficiency, so we need to, in our minds, separate the two. Corruption is essentially abuse of authority. So that is what we are going to be looking at, is abuses of authority, as we have done extensively in this report, which I urge you to read, maybe not cover to cover because it's quite dense, but certainly there are a great number of very interesting findings that we don't have time to go into in detail here now, and I'm sure you'll find our forthcoming report on land and real property to be of equal interest when it is ready. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Дуже дякую, Джеймс, за вашу інформацію, за презентацію. Я думаю, тепер...
Okay, and after your presentation, it's much easier for, I guess, for us to understand the scope of the problem. That 40,000 people that I mentioned, they are You know, all of them are human beings. They feel the pressing nature of this problem. They have been defending this country. We all know many of them probably, and we have invited one of them, Mr. Igor Stadnytsky, to tell us about his brief, you know, very down to earth, so to say, very real story. And let me turn the floor over now to Mr. Igor and invite him to share his narrative with us.
Thank you very much, and glory to Ukraine. I'm Igor Stadnytsky. I'm the participant of military actions. I'm 41. I fought in Brigade 24th, and I was the senior mechanic, and I'm the senior soldier. And I defended the border in 2014. We defended the border of Ukraine at the 0 point in Sector D. This is Зеленопілля, Бірюково, Довжанське, near Anthracite, Ambrosivka. And we survived the Zverinsky battle. And I saved 10 comrades and in the battle. And after all this, I underwent rehabilitation in military hospital in Lviv. Different officials came, deputies came, and some performers. They tried to help us, and they said, if you have some problems, you may address, and we will help, they said. And in the course of treatment, I was put in the queue, and I had number 19 in the queue for the participants of military actions. And in all this time, the queue didn't change, and I addressed deputies and the head of the Supreme Council in order to resolve these issues. I live in a 2-room flat. We have only 30 meters, and there are 3 families living there, and there are 10 people, and no resolution to the problem. And I went to officials, to Lviv City Council. There was no result. The first house that was built in Pilgoloska Street, it should have been for 53 participants of ATO. And they have been building this house for a long time, and they found a construction firm that is under control of the city council, but they could do the less costly option through the tender, but they found this Randbud company, and they built this house for 3 years, and some people said that this is for the money of city, and others say that this is for the from the state budget, and they allocated 41 flats for the families of those who died and for people in reserve. And then in Bogdana Khmelnytsky Street, they built a house, number 231, and the court ruled that this construction is not legal, and the firm allocated and the people, they needed these flats, and they were provided flats. Only 18 flats were provided to the military action participants. And so according to the queue, I had to be number 1. But the queue didn't change, and the union of ATO participants in Poltarsky Street, they didn't invite me. There was no transparency, and also the decision was taken without people. There was no presence of the public, and I'm really concerned. And I would like to say that the situation, my situation and the situation of my comrades, there are people who are disabled and they are in this queue. And there are thousands of military actions participants, and this queue, it doesn't change, and no one knows how people receive those flats. There is no transparency, there is no public publicity of this. I addressed the president during the working visit, and this order of the president is not implemented. And I understand that maybe there is some decentralization in Lviv administration. So the decentralization has its minuses. So one person controls the city, and we cannot find resolution to the problem, even with the help of the deputies of the Supreme Council and the head of the Supreme Council, and even with the help of the president of Ukraine. That's why I call on the public, the society, to hear about this problem, about the problem of, about my problem and about the problem of my comrades. After we completed our duty, it is not appropriate attitude towards people like us. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Igor, for your words, because we believe that we should pay proper attention to this topic. We understand very well that the Ministry of Defense leadership and the President, and we should pay proper attention, and the President addressed the Minister to resolve this problem, but we see that unfortunately the mechanism of implementation, it stalled and it delays the process. Why it is so? So we believe that proper state institutions should deal with it, and I would like to give the floor to Igor Nikolaevich Yaremchuk, the member of the Counting Chamber, and his institution also analyzed what is going on in this area and also reached some conclusions on this. So I would like to ask you to tell the public about the results and what proposals you will provide to all of us in order to resolve this issue. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would like to present the report of the Chamber and the audit of the use of funds by the Ministry of Defense for the buying of stuff and the construction of housing units. So, next slide, please. Next slide. The aim of the audit is to verify the use of the budget funds that were envisaged by the Ministry of Defense 2016-2018. As you may see on the slide, they envisaged the budget of one this sum was allocated, and this money could be used as budget finances for the reconstruction, construction, buying of housing, or monetary compensation. And there were other ways to resolve the problems with housing. the provision of housing to servicemen versus investment construction, mortgage financing from local budget, leasing, and other ways. And these ways were not used by the ministry. So the ministry used only the money that was envisaged by the budget, this 1 billion, more than 1 billion hryvnias. So on this slide, there is such an information, the planning and the use of expenditures. Each year, the Ministry of Finance plans the expenditures for the construction and for buying of houses and also for monetary compensation. And you see the planning made by the Ministry of Defense, and the right side shows the implementation of those figures. So there is a trend. The planning by the ministry is one, and then it is changed. So first they plan for the money of the state budget to build the houses, and according to the results of the year, this money is redistributed and is used for buying built property. So also how they use this money out of the used funds. So in 2 years, the Ministry of Defense built 170 flat house, and this is all.
There has been a lot of other funds invested in the construction that has not yet been completed, and regrettably some of these constructions they remain unfinished for years. In the next slide, you can see the funds that have already been spent on purchasing housing and how much housing was acquired. The next slide shows the main result of the program of housing distribution. It was initiated yet in 1999. As of today, it's practically out of, it's not in effect. You could see the rates of construction envisaged and of the housing that was to be distributed as was envisaged by that program, and what has been attained. You could see here the figure of 45,000 servicemen that were the members of waiting line, and as of now, as a result, so to say, of the implementation of that program, their number increased to 47,000. So as we can see, the amount of funds was not sufficient, even at the planning stage, and the mechanisms that the Defense Ministry could have used, the other mechanisms for solving this problem, they have not been used, these mechanisms. In the next slide, we outlined the main challenges that the Ministry of Defense confronts in this realm. The strategy is needed, the strategy on how to tackle this problem. And then, as soon as this strategy is in place, it could be under the provisions of this strategy, the discussion could be initiated on how to improve the funding, how to increase the funding, and what other steps could be taken in order to speed up this distribution of housing, its acquisition and distribution. Thank you, dear colleagues. As a result of your presentations, we have got the impression of the current status of this problem and how it's being tackled. First of all, let us not rush to the conclusions that it's all the fault of the Defense Ministry. But on the other hand, it certainly is a given fact that the Ministry of Defense is a key player in this area, because the subject of this, or rather the object of this program of housing distribution are the servicemen. And it's the servicemen of the armed forces are entitled to this free housing according to the constitution of Ukraine. And now let me turn the floor over to a representative of the housing directorate of the Defense Ministry. It's the directorate that whose function is to resolve all the issues related to the housing and accommodation of the servicemen. So Mr. Lypko is invited to inform us about the status of this problem and the plans of the Defense Ministry on how to further tackle this problem. Good morning, dear participants of this meeting. I'm delighted to inform you about the work of the Defense Ministry in the area of the housing provision to the servicemen. The format of our meeting is a logical continuation of the discussions and the memorandum that was signed by the Defense Ministry of Ukraine on one side and Transparency International on the other side. I would like to start by saying that the members of the waiting list that has already been mentioned a few times are the servicemen both in active service and also those who have retired and resigned from the armed forces, both the military officers and the non-commissioned officers. And as was already mentioned, we inherited from the Soviet Union times this provision, or rather this function of the Ministry of Defense of providing free housing to the servicemen. Since 1990, or rather at the beginning of the 1990s, there was almost 1 million troops stationed in Ukraine that were withdrawn rather from East European countries where they were stationed in the Soviet times. And all these servicemen were entitled to certain privileges and certain provisions that included also free housing provision to them. 25.3 thousand of those 47,000 people who are in the waiting line, they are entitled to their own housing, and another 22,000 for money are entitled to money compensations. The money that is allocated in the national budget has been substantial, and we are going to use that money to construct 5 houses for 326 flats. And in the next years, we are planning 1,061 flats, new flats, to be acquired. And then some additional funds that we managed to get, more than 680 flats we are going to purchase, and to accommodate more than 300 families more. Since 2007, we started developing the project documentation on the construction of the so-called capsule-type houses, mostly hostels, for more than 1,000 flats. And by the decision of the President of Ukraine, significant funding was allocated. 2.6 billion hryvnias have been allocated for the construction that were meant to be used for these 23,000 contractors that currently serve in the armed forces of Ukraine. And in the next 2019, we are planning to have all these hostels constructed and to be able to accommodate the servicemen in them. The ministry also continues to work on the improvement of legislative basis for this housing provision. And we are going to include the monetary compensations to the servicemen and women of our forces. And the compensations are going to be paid to all of these contractors in the amounts that currently, to which currently the officers are entitled only. We hope that as soon as it is cleared by these documents, the drafts of these documents are cleared by the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine, they would start to be implemented. The Ministry of Defense, on the instruction of the President of Ukraine, has started developing and practically is completing the development of the concept of the housing distribution to the servicemen. What does it include? It includes the provision for the provision of the service housing to the military servicemen who are in active service, and also the opportunity to get some housing and to start using the housing that is in the areas adjacent to the military bases where these servicemen serve. So, according to their positions in the armed forces, these servicemen would be entitled to certain service housing. You should understand, though, that the real estate is not constructed in one day. This requires time. And we certainly are going to continue working on this issue. And we are planning to also start paying to the servicemen who start serving in the armed forces since 2020, the lump sums that, or in the other types of monetary compensations, financial compensation that can be used for housing purposes. And there will be certain standards developed for all categories of the servicemen for this purpose. This concept will be developed and implemented according to the existing legislation of Ukraine and according to the new pieces of legislation that we are planning to develop additionally. We had a discussion at the Reform Committee of the Defense Ministry. We consulted the advisors of that serve in that committee. And we hope that this concept, and that was also their opinion, that the concept with these main provisions that I have mentioned has very good chances for speedy implementation. So we hope that with this concept and with the pieces of legislation that we are planning to get adopted and enacted, this problem will certainly be tackled much quicker and efficiently. Although we must say that not in every military unit these these rates of granting the housing that are rather not quick enough. They are not a cause of enthusiasm among the servicemen themselves. Let me conclude by expressing our gratitude to NAKO and to the volunteer organizations and to the Committee of the Reforms of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. I believe that our cooperation has been fruitful, and we hope that regardless of the long time that is required, or some time that is required, this problem that has had its roots in the previous legacy that dates back dozens of years, it's going to be successfully resolved. And we are glad that we have established this constructive cooperation with NAKO, for example. We had a discussion before this press conference with their experts and representatives, and we are hopeful that we have and we will be having all the necessary prerequisites for successfully providing all the servicemen that are in the waiting list with free housing or the other forms of compensation that would enable them to get that housing otherwise. Thank you, Yuriy Anatolyevich. We have approached the moment when we can initiate our discussion. Anyone who would like to take floor and participate, let me once again introduce Mr. Ohryzko, who is an expert, one of the experts that probably has the most knowledge, who is the most knowledgeable in this problem. So, dear colleagues and guests, please, if you want to ask about something, you're most welcome to put your questions right now. I would like to briefly add to what has already been said. In my view, there should be a sort of a program also at the level of local councils, local authorities that could also be involved in, granting, 3 to 5 flats each year, at least to the people who got injuries, who became disabled, to the families of those who were killed in action. So that this problem is tackled at different levels. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like also to invite Ms. Vlada to say a few words about this problem and your view of it. Well, first of all, I'm honored to say a few words about the problem that affects the people who struggle for Ukraine, and it's really quite sad. It's been quite sad for me to read these figures and the information about these wrongdoings at the time when Ukrainians perish in the front on the front line, and I was particularly encouraged by what's been said by the previous speakers about the other instruments of assistance to those who seek housing, like financial assistance and so on. Also, another issue is also the growing funds, the growth of funds allocated for that, and we invite to also review how the computerized systems of of oversight of the use of different properties of the Defense Ministry are used, and maybe make some improvements. And certainly you are most welcome to ask your questions about these issues or anything else related to this problem. You're most welcome. Ruslan Tkachuk, I'm a military journalist. My question is the following. According to the accounting chamber of the government, a fairly substantial amount of money has been allocated. How this money is being used, and what are the plans, specific plans of the Defense Ministry in this area? Thank you for your question. It's the representative of the Defense Ministry. Well, these bottlenecks with the funds of the national budget, they have been typical for, typically, you know, there have been typically some impediments in the previous years with allocation and especially with the use of that money. How was that money used for the acquisitions of the housing for the military system? For example, what's been happening all the time, each year, the construction works usually were stopped during winter. And that was one of the reasons of this prolongation of the terms of construction of many houses. And I hope that thanks to the previous, earlier this year's order of the defense minister that revised the system of allocation and use of the funds, we will hopefully get about 50 various real estate properties in the next few years. Well, winter is severe here, but we need to repeat it once again that the legislation that entitles Ukrainian citizens, including the servicemen, to free housing, it's obsolete. We need to probably abandon this legislation and this entitlement of free housing. We need to say that, for example, some private companies in the construction sector, they pursue their, usual goals of getting profits, and they are not quite interested in, doing the works when they are not paid for it, and just for the purposes of, social assistance or something like that. That's one of the key reasons of why we have these some of the houses being constructed for years. Therefore, we need to pass to another type of planning, which is this planning for basic needs. Basically, can be described as the planning for covering basic needs. And in our report, you can read more about this system of planning that we suggest be introduced by the Defense Ministry. My name is Ivan Bazarko. Speaking about the concept that you've mentioned, I'm not sure that the concept is the key, so to say, with regard to this problem of free housing. As a rather primitive example, if a medical doctor treats a patient, what he does, first of all, he makes a diagnosis. So we probably need something like that. I didn't want to address this problem, but in my view, still this problem of the assessment of or the assessment of this free housing distribution problem within the Defense Ministry, it has not been efficient. I can see, disparate efforts, like, for example, NAKO is doing what it can do. The other NGOs are involved. But in my view, the electronic register can be a key element of this, for the assessment of the scope of this problem of free housing. And for that, you need to reform probably the significant part of the Ministry of Defense itself. I think that last year, for example, we developed a mechanism for the creation of the central housing management units within the Defense Ministry. And therefore, the reforms that are going on in the Defense Ministry, they should take into account the fact that some of the orders of the Defense Minister, of the Minister of Defense, they are not being implemented by the personnel of the Defense Ministry itself. Therefore, I think that the reform of the Defense Ministry itself and the control of this reform, and then the introduction of these electronic registers and the introduction of understandable, comprehensible, and transparent mechanisms, they could eliminate these instances that, for example, Mr. Igor mentioned, like, for example, in his area, this waiting list was not, remained practically intact. Nobody was getting housing for the last 4 years. For example, a friend of mine from Odessa told me that he had to pay $2,500 just to get a place, a bed in a hostel for the military. That's quite typical. That's what's happening all over Ukraine. And I think that we need to hear this dialogue in the course of which we can develop or improve somehow the existing system. If you mentioned, for example, that for the next year you have in your plans the acquisition of 1,500 of new apartments and flats, I think that with the overall number of 47,000 people waiting in this waiting list, it's not sufficient. So that's my vision of this situation. Thank you, Mr. Bazarko, for your thoughts, your ideas. I'm certain that that they will all be taken into account, both by the Defense Ministry and by our experts when we develop our proposals for the Defense Ministry. We are running out of time. If are there anyone else? Is there anyone else who would like to ask something? If not, then let me conclude by thanking you for your participation in this press conference and emphasize it once again that we are practically at the beginning of resolving this problem, and we are only starting doing more to give our servicemen, some dignified, so to say, housing. Therefore, I invite the public at large not to remain indifferent and to try to add their efforts to the efforts of the Ministry of Defense, to add to the efforts of our organization of NAKO, and so that this problem is resolved. So we are at the beginning of our path, so to say, and we are hopeful that within the next few years we will be able to make serious progress in tackling this problem. Thank you for your attention once again, and thank you for your participation.